In the spring of 1984, Kings Island continued its industry leading innovative ways with the opening of the King Cobra roller coaster. Hello, everybody. Along with the Kings Island King himself, Don Helbig, I'm Ryan Sir, and this is Tower Topics.
Tower Topics is a podcast for Kings Island fans by Kings Island fans because that's who we are and that's who we care about.
Awesome. So, King Cobra. So, I feel like you feel like I hadn't ridden it, but that was actually my first looping coaster.
All right. Yeah. So was there, yeah, kind of toward the beginning of your time getting into theme parks.
Well, I mean, I rode it in the 90s at some point. I was young, so, I went probably 10 or so times a season when I was, like, younger, and then I got out of it, and then I came back around right after King Cobra, actually around 2002, 2003, and King Cobra was really what was it, 2001 or so that it was removed?
Yeah, 2001 at the end of that season.
Yeah, so that was very unceremonious, so it's kinda sad that people never truly got their last rites, but we'll get to that. Um, so, talk about the history of King Cobra at Kings Island. This is kind of an interesting story. When it was built, what made it unique, and like how was it different from other roller coasters? I think we should start with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, in that era, Kings Island was always, on the cutting edge. The first to do something, the tallest, the fastest, the longest. And this was the first roller coaster where the riders, instead of sitting, you stood
Mhm.
on the ride. So it was the first one of its kind. That made it very unique. And, just its placement in the park, so when you came to that area of the park, the ride stood out, because there was the lift hill right there in front of you. And, the trains were interesting looking, and everybody was always, if you didn't know they had a stand up coaster, everyone would point and say, those riders are standing up. So that was kind of noticeable about the ride too.
Yeah, and it's funny because the stand-up breed is very much dying. So a lot of people don't know what the sensation is like. Can you talk about the sensation from the standing position of riding a roller coaster?
I think you're more exposed and free. It enhances the element of the ride when you're standing up. I think that was the biggest difference because other than that, it was still the same kind of a thing as you're going, through the course of the ride. So I think just being, more exposed and free by standing up, you felt a little more vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the things that I liked about it, and this is going to be kind of odd, is that they get the B&M stand-ups now, which I think are far too intense. I think they're uncomfortable. The King Cobra was much shorter, um, and I thought it was a better ride experience because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just, different. You had to straddle the seat and that, but I thought the restraints were comfortable, and you had a fun and enjoyable ride.
Yeah. So, what were some of the memorable features and elements about the King Cobra that made it kind of like unique?
Well, kind of walk through the ride experience. After you were loaded into the trains. Obviously you're standing up. You were taking up a 95-foot hill. Now at that time, that was huge. I
Hmm.
mean, that was taller than the racer. So 95 feet was a pretty tall looking coaster back in that time. And you would go to the top of the lift hill, then you would turn 180 degrees to the right. You'd encounter the first drop, and then you would go right into a vertical loop. And that was probably, when you're standing up, that's kind of because you kind of like would almost like go down a little bit. Your body would kind of like bounce up and down right through that. So that was kind of a unique element there through that vertical loop. Then you would climb up to the first camelback hill. You would allow for some, thrilling airtime moments through that area of the track. And then the train would drop into a 540-degree helix. And what was really unique about this is riders were standing, you're almost completely sideways when you're going through this 540-degree helix through there. And then leaving the helix, you come up to the second camelback hill, followed by the trick track, where the track was straight, but banked to the left before turning to the right. That always surprised riders, the first time riding. And even after riding it several times, you still weren't thinking about that moment coming up until you had an abundance of rides on it. So it was always kind of a fun little unique element to the ride. And then, you know, I always thought that was like a pleasant surprise for riders. And then the track then went over two little bunny hills that delivered these brief airtime moments before the ride came to an end. It was just so much fun.
Yeah, I remember the sideways portions and the helices. That was always my favorite part. I always really, really enjoyed that. So the King Cobra was not the first stand-up coaster. It was the first ground up stand-up
Mm,
coaster
yeah,
because Arrow had
correct.
converted some like mine trains, I think, to be stand-up. But it was also the first stand-up coaster with a loop. But what are some of the innovations that went into creating this particular ride?
I think the things about it was just, that you stood up on it. I think that was the thing that remembered. I don't know that there was, anything really technically advanced about it. I mean, the trains rode over the track the same way as they would any other kind of coaster. You were just standing. Um, but it did lead to more rides of this nature in the 80s and 90s. So they started to become more popular, and you saw, Cedar Point had a stand-up coaster. You had one at Kings Dominion and some other places. So I think it just really more than anything else, due to the popularity, you just saw other parks adding stand-up roller coasters.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a trend that was there in like the early '90s. I mean, in fact, it wasn't like Shockwave and a couple of the other ones. Like,
Shockwave,
weren't they
yeah.
like clones of King Cobra or mirror clones or something like that?
They were not the same exact layout and design. They each had their own unique features to them.
Mm.
They were, it wasn't like you rode one, you rode them all. It felt a little bit different.
Oh, yeah, I mean, especially in the setting and so on. So King Cobra had that iconic design with like the trains that look like snakes and all that. Talk about how that affected the ride experience itself and the legacy of the ride.
I think really more than anything else, it just enhanced the atmosphere, of with the theming and everything of it. It kind of fit in that area of the park, which at that time was, like an adventure village and, whatever they wanted to call it, during those different years that it was in operation. But it kind of really more than anything else, it just really fit the area, with the color of the ride, the green and the yellow and the way the trains looked, and it just fit other attractions that were in that area at the time.
So, like any other coaster, probably any other major like engineering project, there are some interesting stories that come along with the construction and so on of the ride. What are some of the ones for King Cobra?
I think one of the bigger things, that I would say the development and the construction of the ride was just the safety concerns, because when you're sitting down and you got the lap bar and that, you know what the riders are going to do throughout the ride. But when you have a stand-up coaster, it's a little different because, riders could kick their legs out, they could kick them straight up, they could, put them on the outside. So I think there was a lot of different things with that to be concerned about is the safety component of it. I think for Kings Island, who has just an impeccable track record of safety, I think that was one of those things that they always had to really keep a close eye on was just what were the riders doing on the ride. You weren't going to come out, but you also want them to remain in that standing position and not be moving their legs around and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you got to bolt their legs down. One other story that comes to mind is that uh, Kings Island officials went to Japan to ride the
Hmm.
King Cobra.
They did right before that, yeah, before, and then they disassembled it and brought it over and built it at the
I
park.
want to say it was Dave Folke. Is that his name?
Dave
Was he
Folke,
one of the
right?
ones
Yeah,
there?
Dave Folke.
Yeah.
He was one of the ones that went over, right, yeah.
I don't know where I pulled that
So several
information
several
from.
people from the park went over and did that, and when they did the test ride over there, it was, the ride wasn't, painted or anything like that. It was just the natural steel color and everything when they wrote it. The original, concept name for it was Astro
Oh,
Comet.
really? I feel like they won with King Cobra. Astro Comet sounds like it was named in the '60s.
Yeah, I mean, King Cobra had that logo that was right up there with, what they were coming out with at the time, with they had the beast and then you had the bat, which unfortunately didn't, last more than a couple years there. But King Cobra was, just a tremendous logo. And even now when they have those retro shirts in the gift shops there, it's one of the most popular selling ones.
Yeah. So Kings Island then retired King Cobra in 2001 very quietly. What were some of the reasons behind that? Um, and how did the park decide on like the replacement that was going to go there?
I think one of the main reasons was the manufacturer was no longer in business, so getting parts was going to be a challenge, and the ride had been around long enough that it was starting to fatigue in different areas, as rides do as they get older, and just finding those replacement parts were going to be hard. But they needed something that was going to be, fun, thrilling. If you're going to get rid of a roller coaster, you need to replace it with something that's at least thrilling if it's not going to be a roller coaster, and that led to the decision to bring in Delirium.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it was, one of those decisions where they were doing early season inspection and they were like, "Oh, we gotta replace these pieces." Nope. You know?
Yeah, and it just gets, and it also, the novelty had kind of worn out,
Yeah.
about standing up, and people were into different type of thrills. Rides were getting taller and faster, and you just have to make those hard decisions at times.
Yeah, you're almost never gonna, you know, put a lot of money into an obsolete ride from 1982, you know? It's just not gonna happen from a business standpoint. Um, so, we were talking about, like, the anecdote of it being built, but I wanted to bring this up because we didn't have this in our notes, but, if you my friend Ronnie, from ronniesalerno.com did a
Hmm.
huge research piece on, the King Cobra and not the really the King Cobra, but the fact that Togo International had offices in Middletown. And they did this to warm the relationship with well, mainly with Kings Island because I think they were the first to buy a Togo. Um,
Hmm.
but they had a whole office, and my understanding is they had, like, a plant and they would build roller huge pieces of track and assemble them and see how they looked in the parking lot. Drew a bunch of people from Kings Island maintenance away. Obviously, when Togo went through a couple different bankruptcies, and at one point they closed all of their American operations. But that's another tidbit. So for those of middies up there in Middletown, you used to have a roller coaster manufacturer in your backyard. You know,
They
yeah.
did.
Um, when they removed the King Cobra, how do you feel like that changed, like, the roller coaster landscape of Kings Island?
Well, it just removed a coaster from its lineup. You never want to do that. You go into these marketing campaigns where you're touting how many roller coasters you have. At the time you might say we have 12 roller coasters, more than anyone else. And next year you have 13 and 14. But so you remove a coaster from that lineup, it always leaves a void.
Yeah.
I don't care what roller coaster it is. I mean, whether it's King Cobra, the Bat, the original Bat, Vortex. There's always a void whenever a roller coaster leaves because you aren't replacing with that same kind of experience. So I think that's where it's kind of affected the overall landscape is that you don't have that stand up ride experience anymore to offer your guest.
Yeah. So I feel like the ride is very nostalgically, talked about in a lot of cases for the people that got to ride it and the people that just got to hear about it. What are some of your experiences on it that you remember fondly?
So I had a lot of fun with it. I ended up riding it 808 times. Media day for the ride. I was on the first train that went out of the station when they invited the media. A lot of people from Togo, and the country were there at this media day event. At that time, it wasn't open to the world, like a lot of these events are now.
Mhm.
So I was one of the few roller coaster enthusiasts there. Carl Eichelman was there as well. I remember it being kind of a damp, real overcast, kind of a chilly day, but ended up riding it 37 times on media day, and every time, I would just laugh. Getting off. It was just fun. It was just different. Back at that time, the Vortex had yet to be built, so it was one of my, really first steel roller coaster experiences that I had outside of the Screaming Demon. And a couple other smaller ones. The Corkscrew at Cedar Point, and that. So it was one of the first, major steel roller coasters that I'd ever been on. And you just get back on the station, you'd want to get right back in line and ride it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I mentioned this top of the program, but this was my first looping coaster, and I think that, like, today's Ryan would be like, "No, I'd rather sit down and loop 6 times than stand and loop once," because that definitely sounds scarier, but for me and I don't know, like, you kind of came up in a different day and age when the loops weren't all that common, but, I basically grew up in a
It was a big deal.
well, right, right, but I basically grew up in a world where, like, we never didn't have the vortex, we never didn't have the King Cobra, so, the logic to me was I can ride this, it only loops once, and I can, see what it's like to loop. So yeah, I'll always remember that as my first looping coaster, so that'll be kind of interesting. So, when it comes to, like, the legacy of the ride, like, where do you see it, like, from the eyes of the average guest, the enthusiast, and the park?
Well, I think just that iconic logo, is gonna last forever in people's minds. The innovation piece of it, being the first of its kind in the United States, I think that's another piece of its legacy. That it was, came during an era when Kings Island was all about being, innovative and the first to try something.
Yeah, a long time there when they had the first of this and the first of that and this record breaking, that record breaking. All right, Don, we've got a user question.
We do. The question from one of our followers on our X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, they ask, and it's from Single Rail Industries: could we ever see Son of Beast returning? Ryan, I'll let you answer this.
Let me look at the language of his question. Could we ever see Son of Beast returning? Ever is a very long time. So I'm gonna say yes, but don't hold your breath because it would be one of those things where 50 years from now, Kings Island had this legendary coaster as a looping wooden coaster. There's pictures of it. Maybe Banshee's still there and the grave is still there or whatever, and they have some fun with that in a name. But I think it would be stupid anytime in the next 2 decades at least to make allusion to Son of Beast or name a ride Son of Beast or whatever, because the ride did not have a good reputation. You have to assume that people come in not knowing a whole lot. So if they built a new wooden coaster and they called it Son of Beast, even if they built a steel coaster and called it Son of Beast, there's going to be a certain percentage of the population that thinks it's the same ride, and they're going to think that, oh, they're just choosing to advertise that horrible, rough ride that's down a lot. Like I said, ever is a very long time. I think eventually in one of our lifetimes, they'll have some sort of ride that alludes to it or is called Son of Beast, but I wouldn't see them bringing it back. Not anytime soon. What are your thoughts?
What's the name of that song from Frozen by Adina
L-
Menzel? Oh
Let it.
yeah, Let It
Oh,
Go.
yeah,
That's my thoughts on it.
yeah. I feel like even with the King Cobra and stuff, like we both have nostalgic memories and so on, but Son of Beast is just no part of me ever is, "Ah, God, I miss that ride." I think that about the Vortex and, a bunch of other different rides, but with Son of Beast, it was just kinda like it was like a chore to ride. If anything, yes, it was uncomfortable, and yes, it had its problems, but, like, it took forever to load and stuff. It was like a once or twice a season ride for me anyway, but yeah. I mean, like I said, ever is a very long time.
It
So the
is.
answer is yes, but not soon. Okay, well, that's a very good question, but hey, I'm Ryan Sir along with Don Helbig, and this is Tower Topics.